The YouTube channel Soda TCG recently released a video talking about how the mulcharmies are bad card design. I really appreciate Soda making this video because I think it brings up a lot of important points and I think it's worth talking about the design of these cards. However, I do disagree with some of the points in the video, and that's what I wanted to talk about here. If you haven't watched Soda's video, I left a link in the description and I would definitely recommend watching it first. It brings up some very important points. I think it's well made. And I'm not going to replay it in its entirety here. I'm just going to go over a few key points of discussion. First of all, I absolutely agree that the mulcharmies are bad card design, and for a lot of the reasons that Soda gives in the video, such as the fact that it's not an interesting card for the person using it because you just drop Fuelos as soon as your opponent is going to special summon a monster. It's not nearly as interesting to time as a hand trap compared to something like Infinite Impermanence or Nibiru the Primal Being. Soda also talks about how it still causes the basic Maxx C feeling of my deck is being shut down. I can't execute my strategy because it's going to give my opponent too many draws, and I don't have a way to really counteract that fact unless I draw the out with something like Ash Blossom or Called by the Grave. And I also agree that it creates a homogeneous deck building problem. It's of course not nearly as bad as Maxx C, but it still creates the problem of very homogeneous deck building, and it removes interesting choices around what hand traps to play because of course you're going to play 3 Fuelos in a lot of cases. The problem that I wanted to talk about is the question of what we do about this. So Soda brings up the idea that one of the problems with the mulcharmies is they don't have restrictions. Of course, there's one restriction, which is you can only use it going second. Unless you pass on an empty board, you can't use a mulcharmy when you go first. But any deck can put Fuelos in their deck. So whether you're Malice or Ryzeal or Blue Eyes or Yummy or whatever, everybody can play mulcharmy Fuelos. So to counteract this, Soda proposes adding a restriction to mulcharmy Fuelos to make it so that only certain decks can run the card. I personally disagree with this approach, and I think it's not the right way to address mulcharmy Fuelos. The reason is, mulcharmy Fuelos is not only a problem because it's put in every deck, it's also a problem because it's simply not a well-designed card. And Soda talks about this in other parts of the video where, for example, it's not interesting or skillful for the person who has the Fuelos to just activate it as soon as their opponent tries to summon something. And the fact that it still causes the basic Maxx C feeling of having part of your deck just shut down with no recourse. Those problems don't go away when you restrict Fuelos to only being played in certain decks. It just means that you have that awful feeling of opponent activating Fuelos against you sometimes rather than all the time. Of course, having it sometimes is obviously better than having it all the time, but it would really be better if we just didn't have it in the first place. I want to make an analogy here to Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter is a hand trap that says if you have no cards in your graveyard quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. Until the end of the next turn, any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Now, historically, Dimension Shifter has been an extremely powerful card in certain formats where there are decks that rely heavily on the graveyard that can be shut down for an entire turn cycle just with the activation of Dimension Shifter. And in fact, Dimension Shifter suffers from many of the same problems that we talk about with mulcharmy Fuelos. First of all, Dimension Shifter is not interesting or skillful for the person activating it. Often the way that you would play Shifter is if you open it in your starting hand, you would just immediately drop it into the graveyard in the draw phase and hope that it shut down your opponent's strategy. From the opponent's perspective, you also have the same problem where, like mulcharmy Fuelos, Dimension Shifter is a lingering effect, which means once it's resolved, there's no way to reverse the effect. The only way to stop it is to draw the out with something like Called by the Grave to stop it at the time that it's activated. So Dimension Shifter suffers from these same problems as Fuelos, and it also has the problem of completely shutting off certain parts of the opponent's strategy. The reason I'm bringing up Dimension Shifter is that I think Dimension Shifter is a very badly designed card, but Dimension Shifter has a restriction that means it was only played in certain decks. Not every deck could play Dimension Shifter because when you resolve Dimension Shifter, you also turn off your own graveyard. So if you are playing a deck that relies on the graveyard, it's often not a good idea to run Shifter. That means that there were certain decks that could play Shifter and certain decks that wouldn't. And that actually coined an entire term, which is shifter deck. You would have people talking about decks like Fluonderies and Exosister as shifter decks, where part of their identity is just the fact that they don't rely on the graveyard, so they're able to run Dimension Shifter. The thing is, the fact that Shifter could only be run in certain decks did not make it a fun card. It did not make it a well-designed card. It did not make it a card that should exist in the game. So the fact that Dimension Shifter had restrictions really did not solve any of the core problems with the card and the reasons that people didn't like it in the first place. The problem with Mulcharmy Fulos is not just that it's in every deck. The problem is that it's not a well-designed card. And just like with Shifter, that doesn't change if you restrict it to only being played in certain decks. So that's why I personally believe that adding a restriction to Fulos so that it can only be played in certain decks is not the right way to address the problem. Soda asks the question of how do we fix the mulcharmies, Fulos being the most generic and powerful one. But I want to argue that instead we shouldn't try to fix Maxx C. When Maxx C was originally being debated, a lot of people would talk about how Maxx C is a huge problem, but maybe we could fix it by adding some restrictions. It was a very popular talking point for people to say that maybe Maxx C wouldn't be a problem if you could only use it going second, rather than being able to use it going first. There were a lot of people talking about maybe if we add some restrictions to Maxx C to make it weaker and less universally powerful, that will fix the card and make it a well-designed card. And when we got the mulcharmies, that's exactly what happened. We have these new cards that function similarly to Maxx C, but they have additional restrictions that make them less universally powerful, and yet it did not solve the problem. We had Maxx C. We said, if only we could add some restrictions. Konami created a new card with those restrictions, and it didn't work. Mulcharmy Fulos is still not a well-designed card. This is why I think the idea that we could fix the mulcharmies is a fundamentally flawed one. I think the design of this card is fundamentally broken, and the idea that we can add more restrictions to fix it has already been proved wrong by the mulcharmies themselves, because the mulcharmies were an attempt to add restrictions to Maxx C to make it more balanced, and it didn't work. And we should not respond to that by trying to add more restrictions. We should respond to that by realizing that it's simply not a well-designed card, and we should look elsewhere for the solutions to our problems. It's absolutely true that we need ways to stop decks that wombo combo and put out an unbreakable end board going first. This is a very common problem in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where decks can simply do too much going first, and if you're the going second player and you don't manage to completely stop them, it can feel like it's impossible to win. However, Maxx C is simply not the right approach to solving that problem, and no amount of restrictions is going to make it a well-designed card. Mulcharmy Fulos is a very variance-heavy card because it's often dead going first, but extremely powerful going second, and can completely warp the game based on whether it resolves or not. Adding more restrictions is simply not the right approach. We really need to start to think about different ways that we can make going second viable without using this type of card design. I think that Maxx C and the mulcharmies are not fixable, and we should try to come up with a different solution, because this is just never going to be fun. So those are my thoughts on Maxx C and the mulcharmies, and why I think we should not try to fix Maxx C, but instead we should think about what other ways we can change the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And the card design in order to make going second more viable. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd love to see what other people think about this. And I want to thank Soda TCG again for bringing up this discussion in the first place, because I think it's worth having, and I really appreciate his original video. With that, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.